The music box had played the same 8 notes for as long as Eleanor could remember. Her mother had wound it every night of her childhood. It was the last thing in the world that was truly hers, and her stepmother sold it in front of everyone, for the price of a pair of gloves, simply to watch Eleanor's face when it was gone. "Oh, don't look so stricken, girl," Lady Margaret said, pressing the little rosewood box into the buyer's hands with a bright, gracious smile, as the drawing-room full of guests looked on. "It's a cheap, ugly little thing. Sentiment is a luxury for people who can afford it. And you, my dear, can afford nothing." A ripple of polite laughter. "Do try to remember your place." Eleanor did not weep. She had learned, in the 4 years since her father died, that weeping only gave her stepmother something to enjoy. She stood very still, and she watched the one piece of her mother she had left in the world disappear into a stranger's coat pocket. And she said nothing at all. The buyer wound it idly once on his way out. 8 notes drifted across the room, her mother's tune, thin and sweet, and then the lid snapped shut, and it was gone. The whole room thought they had just watched a wealthy woman put a poor dependent in her place, a small, ordinary cruelty. Nothing more. But I need you to hold on to one strange thing, because everything turns on it. Lady Margaret was a cold, careful, calculating woman who never in her life did anything without a reason. And a woman like that does not go to the trouble of arranging a public sale in front of 40 guests to be rid of a worthless little music box she could have simply thrown in the fire any night she pleased. So why? Why that box? Why in front of everyone? Why did it matter so much to Lady Margaret that a cheap, ugly, sentimental little thing be gotten rid of? Publicly, finally, and for good. Because it was never worthless. And somewhere across that room, a duke had just watched the whole thing. And he had noticed exactly the same thing you should be noticing now. Stay with me. To understand what was sold that day, you have to understand what Eleanor had lost long before it. She had not always been the poor dependent in the corner. Once, a long time ago, it sometimes seemed, Eleanor Hartley had been the beloved only daughter of a warm, comfortable house. Her mother had filled it with music and small kindnesses. Her father had adored them both. For 12 years, Eleanor had been a child who was wanted. Then her mother died. A fever, they said, sudden and cruel, one gray autumn. And her father, lost, grieving, adrift, had within 2 years married again. A handsome, elegant widow named Margaret, who had smiled at Eleanor with her mouth and never once with her eyes. For a while it was bearable. Her father still lived, and while he lived, Margaret played the part of a mother. But when Eleanor was 17, her father died too. Another fever, another gray autumn. And the moment the last spadeful of earth was on his grave, the performance ended. Margaret had inherited everything. The house, the money, the control of Eleanor's future. And Eleanor, the daughter of the house, the child who had once been so wanted, became, overnight, something between a poor relation and an unpaid servant. She mended Margaret's gowns and fetched Margaret's tea and sat in the cold corners of Margaret's dinners, and she was reminded, daily and thoroughly, that she was there on sufferance and worth precisely nothing. She kept one thing through all of it, one thing Margaret, for 4 years, had never quite managed to take. Her mother's music box until today. 4 years. Think about that. For 4 years, Lady Margaret has controlled every scrap of Eleanor's life, her home, her money, her food, her freedom. She could have taken that music box any day she liked. She could have lost it or broken it or simply thrown it out with the ashes, and Eleanor could have done nothing. But she didn't. For 4 years she left it alone. And then today, suddenly she arranged an entire public spectacle to be rid of it, permanently and in front of witnesses. Something changed. Something made that little box, after 4 years of not mattering, suddenly matter enormously. And Eleanor, watchful Eleanor, who has learned to notice everything, is about to start asking why. There was one person at Lady Margaret's gathering who did not, belonged to her glittering little world, and who watched the whole cruel performance with entirely different eyes. His name was Adrian, and he was the Duke of Ashford. He had come only as a courtesy. Lady Margaret had angled for a duke at her table for a year, and he had finally wearily accepted, expecting nothing but a dull afternoon among people who bored him. He was not an easy man in company. There were stories about the Duke of Ashford, that he was cold, that he was remote, that he had buried himself in his estate and his books and turned away from society for reasons no one quite knew. Some of the stories were true. And then, at a dull afternoon gathering, he watched an elegant woman sell a girl's dead mother's music box in front of a laughing room, purely to enjoy the girl's pain. And he watched the girl refuse to give her the tears she wanted. But the Duke of Ashford was not only moved by Eleanor's dignity, he was a great deal cleverer than most of the people in that room, and something about the whole performance struck him as wrong. Wrong in a way he couldn't immediately name. He watched Lady Margaret's face as the box left the room, and he saw something there that did not match her light, cruel words at all. He saw relief, not the small satisfaction of a cruelty enjoyed, something deeper and colder and far more telling. The relief of a woman who has finally, after long worry, gotten rid of something dangerous. And that is the thing that turns this from a sad story into a dangerous one. Because the Duke of Ashford didn't just see a girl being humiliated, he saw a woman who was relieved. And relief is the wrong emotion entirely for someone disposing of a worthless trinket. You are not relieved to throw away rubbish. You are relieved to destroy evidence. The Duke had spent a lifetime reading the faces of clever, dangerous people, and Lady Margaret's face, in the moment that music box left the room, told him that the little rosewood box was not what anyone in that room believed it to be. So, he did something that surprised even him. On his way out, quietly, he found the buyer, and he bought the music box back. Eleanor did not weep that night, though she wanted to. She sat on the edge of her narrow servant's bed, in the cold little room that had once been a nursery when the house still loved her, and she pressed her hands together in her lap, and she shook once, all the way through. But she did not weep. Weeping was for people who had given up, and Eleanor, for reasons she could not entirely have explained, had not given up. Not quite, not yet. Because sensible, watchful Eleanor, the girl whose whole survival for 4 years had depended on noticing things, had noticed something today, and the noticing would not let her rest. Why did she sell it in front of everyone? Margaret was cruel, yes. Margaret enjoyed Eleanor's pain, yes. But Margaret was also careful, the most careful person Eleanor had ever known. Everything Margaret did, she did for a reason, and usually for money. And there was no money in that music box. It was worth a few shillings at most. Margaret had sold it for the price of gloves and made a public show of it. And Margaret did not do things for the price of gloves. And Margaret did not make public shows without purpose. She wanted witnesses, Eleanor thought slowly, in the dark. She wanted it gone. And she wanted everyone to see it gone, as if she needed it to be finished, settled, beyond recovering. And then a colder thought, as if she was afraid of it. Eleanor sat very still in the dark. She had spent 4 years being told she was nothing, and she had very nearly come to believe it. But some stubborn, watchful, unbroken part of her sat up now and said clearly, "Margaret is afraid of my mother's music box, and I want to know why." If you felt that turn, the moment the humiliated girl in the cold little room stops grieving and starts thinking, then you already know what this channel is about. The overlooked ones, the quiet ones, the people the world decides don't matter, right up until the moment they decide to look. That's every story I tell here. Subscribe and stay with me, because Eleanor is about to pull one thread, and a secret 4 years in the hiding is going to come apart in her hands. Eleanor had exactly one problem. She had a question, but she had no power on earth to answer it. A penniless dependent, watched and controlled, and owning nothing, could not go chasing a sold music box across the county. She had noticed the thread. She had no way to pull it. And then, 3 days later, the Duke of Ashford came back. He came on a pretext so thin it embarrassed the footman. Some business with the estate, he said, that everyone knew was nothing. Lady Margaret, scenting a duke, descended in her finest afternoon gown and turned upon him the full, practiced force of her charm. He was perfectly glacially polite to her. And then he asked, to the astonishment of the entire house, whether he might have a word in private with Miss Eleanor Hartley, the dependent, the servant girl, the one who had been so satisfyingly humiliated 3 days before. Lady Margaret's smile did not slip, but Eleanor, who watched everything now, saw her stepmother's eyes go very still. The stillness of a careful woman, sensing for the first time a piece on the board she had not placed there herself. In the cold morning room, with the door open for propriety and Margaret no doubt straining to listen beyond it, The Duke of Ashford wasted no words. He simply reached into his coat and set a small rosewood music box on the table between them. Eleanor's breath stopped. "I bought it back," he said quietly, "on my way out, 3 days ago. I want to be honest with you about why, Miss Hartley, because I think you are a person who is owed honesty and has had very little of it." He met her eyes. "I did not buy it because I pitied you. I bought it because I watched your stepmother's face when it left the room, and she did not look like a woman being cruel. She looked like a woman being safe, and I have lived long enough to know that people only look like that when they've destroyed something they were afraid of." He paused. "So before I give this back to you, and it is yours, and I will give it back, I have to ask you a question. Do you have any idea at all why your mother's music box would frighten a woman like Lady Margaret?" And Eleanor, who had been asking herself that exact question for 3 sleepless nights, looked at the Duke of Ashford and did the most extraordinary thing. She didn't weep with gratitude. She got practical. "No," she said, "but I've been awake 3 nights asking. And, Your Grace, I think we should open it." They opened it together, there in the cold morning room, with Lady Margaret prowling somewhere beyond the door. At first it was only what it had always been, a simple rosewood box, worn smooth at the corners by her mother's hands, the little brass mechanism inside playing its thin, sweet 8 notes when Eleanor wound it, the sound of her whole lost childhood. Back in her hands again. She had to stop for a moment. She had not thought she would ever hear it again. But the Duke was watching the box, not listening to it. And when the tune wound down, he turned it over in his long hands and pressed and frowned and pressed again. And his fingers found the seam. The base of the box was false. It came away under his thumb with a soft click, a shallow hidden compartment, no thicker than a finger, built into the bottom of the box beneath the mechanism. And folded into it, yellowed and creased and hidden for years, was a paper. Eleanor's hands were shaking too badly to take it, so the Duke unfolded it carefully and read it and went very still. "Miss Hartley," he said quietly, "what was your mother's name? Her full name, before she married your father?" "Cassandra," Eleanor whispered. "Cassandra Vane." The Duke looked up from the paper, and there was something in his face she had never seen a powerful man aim at her before. It was respect. "Then I think you had better sit down," he said gently, "because your mother was not who you were told she was, and neither, Miss Hartley, are you." Feel the floor tilt, because it's tilting under Eleanor at the very same moment. For 4 years she has believed she was nothing, a poor dependent worth precisely what her stepmother said she was worth, which was nothing at all. And a Duke has just opened her dead mother's music box, found a paper hidden in a secret compartment, read her mother's maiden name, and told her that everything, safe everything, she was told about herself is a lie. The music box was never a sentimental trinket. It was a hiding place. Her mother hid something in it, and her stepmother spent 4 years and one very public sale trying to make certain it was never ever found. It took the Duke's solicitors 9 days to confirm what the paper in the music box had begun to tell them, and when Eleanor finally understood the whole of it, she had to sit down a second time. Her mother, Cassandra Vane, had not been a poor gentleman's wife. She had been the only child, the sole heiress, of a wealthy and titled family, the Vanes, who had cut her off in fury when she married Eleanor's father for love instead of the grand match they'd arranged. But cutting off was not the same as disinheriting, and Cassandra's own mother, Eleanor's grandmother, had, in secret and in defiance of the family, left a settlement, a fortune, and an estate, and an old title that passed through the female line, held in trust for Cassandra, and after Cassandra, for her eldest daughter, for Eleanor. The paper in the music box was the proof of it. A copy of the settlement, in her grandmother's own hand, hidden by Cassandra, where she believed no one would ever think to look, inside the humble little music box she wound every night, the last place anyone would search for a fortune, and Lady Margaret had known. That was the cold heart of it. Margaret had not married Eleanor's grieving father for love, or even for his modest comfort. She had married him because she had learned, somehow some years before, that his quiet, unremarkable little daughter was in fact the hidden heiress to a vain fortune, waiting in trust. Margaret's entire scheme, from the very beginning, had been to position herself as the girl's guardian. keep her ignorant and cowed and worthless, and quietly maneuver the inheritance into her own hands when the time came. There had only ever been one danger to the plan, one piece of proof that could unravel everything. The settlement document, which Margaret had searched for years and never found, because it was hidden in the one thing so beneath her notice that she had never once thought to look inside it, a cheap, ugly, sentimental little music box. Until, at last, perhaps she'd finally guessed, perhaps she'd simply run out of patience, Margaret had decided she could not risk it existing any longer, and she had sold it, publicly, finally, to be rid of it for good. She hadn't humiliated Eleanor over a trinket. She had been destroying the one piece of evidence that stood between herself and a stolen fortune, and using the girl's public humiliation as the cover. So, there it is. The question from the very first minute answered. Why would a careful, calculating woman sell one worthless little music box in front of 40 witnesses? Because it was never worthless. It was the hiding place of a fortune and the proof of a theft, and the one thing on earth that could destroy her. And every cruelty Eleanor had suffered for 4 years, every cold meal, every mended gown, every reminder that she was nothing, was a wall Margaret had built to keep the true heiress from ever looking up and seeing what she was standing on. But here is what Margaret does not yet know. She didn't destroy the music box. A duke bought it. The proof is safe, and the girl she spent 4 years convincing was nothing has just discovered she is everything. Stay with me, because the moment Margaret realizes the box survived, this stops being a theft and becomes a war. Lady Margaret was many cruel things, but she was not a fool. That had always been her danger. She noticed the Duke's second visit. She noticed the private conversation she had not been able to fully overhear. She noticed that her cowed, silent stepdaughter had begun, in the days after, to move about the house with a new and unsettling stillness. Not the stillness of defeat, which Margaret knew well and enjoyed, but the stillness of someone who is waiting. And Margaret, who had built her entire comfortable life on the certainty that Eleanor would never look up, felt for the first time the cold touch of a plan going wrong. She came to Eleanor's room that night, and for the first time in 4 years, the performance dropped entirely. No gracious smile, no honeyed cruelty, nothing but the cold, hard, calculating woman who had been underneath all along. It was the most frightening thing Eleanor had ever seen, because she had never once seen her stepmother without the mask. "You've been busy," Margaret said, standing in the doorway of the cold little room. "Duke's calling, private, conversations, little errands. It doesn't suit you, Eleanor. You were always so much more restful when you knew your place." "I know about my grandmother's settlement," Eleanor said. She saw no reason to pretend. "I know what my mother hid in the music box. I know what you married my father to steal, and I know you've spent 4 years searching for that proof and never found it." Something flickered across Margaret's face, and it was not guilt. It was calculation. "And where is it now, I wonder?" she said softly. "This proof, this precious paper, in the keeping of your Duke, I imagine. How convenient, how fragile." She stepped into the room. "Let me tell you how this ends, my dear, since you seem to have forgotten your position. That settlement means nothing until it is proved before a court, and a court will take the word of a respectable widow over a servant girl and a reclusive duke who has clearly been charmed by a pretty face. I will call it a forgery. I will call you a scheming little liar who invented a fortune to escape her betters, and I have 4 years of you living quietly as my dependent to prove that you never believed a word of it yourself." Her smile returned, and it was terrible. "Reach for this, Eleanor, and I will destroy you, and I will destroy your Duke's name along with you. Stay in your place, and I may yet be generous. Choose." And she turned and swept out, and left Eleanor alone in the dark. There is the escalation, the villain who will not stop at the theft. Margaret has realized the proof survived, and she has done exactly what people like her always do. She has threatened not just Eleanor, but the one person who could save her. She'll ruin the Duke. She'll call the truth a forgery. She'll use 4 years of Eleanor's own forced silence as a weapon against her. And Eleanor, sitting alone in the dark, understands the real shape of what's coming. It is not a search anymore. It is a fight. and her stepmother has just promised to burn down everything and everyone rather than let the girl she erased win. Here is what Lady Margaret, for all her cold cleverness, had never once factored into her calculations. She had spent 4 years underestimating Eleanor. It was the habit of her whole life, and she did it now, at the worst possible moment, when everything was at stake, because Margaret thought she was in a fight about a document, whether a single hidden paper could stand up in a court against a respectable widow's word. And on that battlefield, Margaret held real weapons: her reputation, her respectability, the simple fact that the world believed women like her and dismissed girls like Eleanor. But Eleanor, watchful Eleanor, servant Eleanor, the girl who had spent 4 years being invisible in her stepmother's house, had realized something Margaret hadn't. She wasn't going to win this with one piece of paper. She was going to win it by proving the whole of what Margaret was. "A single document she can call a forgery," Eleanor said to the Duke, thinking fast and cold now. 4 years of watchfulness turned at last to purpose. "But she can't call everything a forgery. She's been in this house for years, Your Grace, running her schemes. And do you know who's been in every room, fetching and carrying and utterly beneath her notice the entire time?" A grim smile. "Me, the servant, the furniture. I have seen things. Letters she left lying about. Visitors she never troubled to hide from a girl who didn't count. I didn't understand what I was seeing at the time, but I remember all of it. And now I know what I'm looking for." The Duke looked at her with that same dawning respect. "You're going to build the whole case." "Every piece of it," Eleanor said. "Not just my grandmother's settlement. Proof of what she knew and when and how long she's been planning this. And then," her eyes sharpened, "we don't do it in a quiet courtroom where she can bury it in years of paper and reputation. We do it where she can't hide behind either, in front of everyone whose good opinion is the only thing she's ever truly loved. Do you see what the servant girl just did? She refused the fight her enemy chose. Margaret built the whole trap around a single document, around whether one piece of paper could survive a courtroom. And Eleanor looked at that trap and simply stepped around it. She's not going to stake everything on one page. She's going to prove the entire pattern, using 4 years of things she was allowed to see precisely because no one imagined the servant was watching. Every letter left lying out, every careless word spoken in front of the furniture. Margaret's own contempt handed Eleanor the evidence, brick by brick. And now the girl is going to build the wall. But Eleanor, being Eleanor, found one more thing in those weeks of quiet searching. And it was the thing that turned her cause from revenge into something she could carry afterward. She found the truth about her mother's death. She had always been told it was a fever, sudden, cruel, natural, a gray autumn, and then her mother was gone. But buried in Margaret's old correspondence, in a locked writing case that a servant dusting a room could reach when no one thought her worth watching, Eleanor found letters that did not fit the story. Letters that placed Margaret in the district and in contact with Eleanor's father months before her mother died. Letters that spoke, in careful and terrible euphemism, of an obstacle that would soon be removed, and a grieving widower who would need consoling. Her mother's fever had not been an accident of nature. It had been the beginning of the plan. Eleanor sat on the floor of that room with the letters in her lap for a very long time. She had come looking for proof of a stolen fortune. She had found proof of a stolen life. And something in her, some last thread that 4 years of grinding cruelty had worn very thin, did not snap into despair. It settled instead into a resolve as cold and clear as winter water. "She didn't just steal my inheritance," Eleanor told the Duke, her voice steady in a way that frightened even her. "She took my mother. She murdered her, Adrian, or as near to it as makes no difference, and then she married the grieving man she'd made a widower, and spent 4 years teaching his daughter she was worthless. All so no one would ever look too closely at any of it." She set the letters down. "I'm not doing this for the fortune. I don't care about the fortune. I'm doing it so that my mother, who hid the truth in a music box and trusted that someday someone would find it, finally gets to be believed. And that's why she's the heroine, and not merely the girl who got lucky." The easy version of this story ends with Eleanor recovering her fortune and her Duke, and leaving Margaret to stew in her defeat. But Eleanor opens a locked case looking for money and finds a murder. finds that the fever that took her mother was no fever at all. And in that moment, the whole thing stops being about an inheritance and becomes about something far older and far deeper. A daughter who will not let her mother's death stay a lie. That's the difference between revenge and justice. Revenge wants what it lost. Justice makes sure the truth is finally spoken out loud. They laid it carefully in the weeks that followed, and the beauty of it was that Margaret never suspected the true shape of it. Because Margaret was watching the wrong danger. She watched the Duke. She watched for lawyers, for a court summons, for the single document she was so confident she could discredit. She had threatened him. He had, to all appearances, retreated. She had cowed her stepdaughter. The girl had, to all appearances, gone quiet and frightened again. Margaret sailed toward the grandest event of her season. A great ball she was hosting, the very peak of the respectability she had killed and stolen to secure, believing she had frightened them into silence. And all the while, quietly, the case was built. Eleanor's grandmother's settlement, safe in the Duke's keeping. The letters proving Margaret knew of the fortune before she ever married Eleanor's father. The correspondence placing her in the district before Cassandra's death. And the terrible euphemisms about an obstacle removed. The music box itself and the hidden compartment. And the physician's old records that, examined again with the right questions asked, no longer looked quite so much like a natural fever. Piece by piece, a woman's whole cold architecture of theft and murder, laid out in a single bound folio. And Eleanor chose the moment with the precision of a girl who had waited 4 years for it, Margaret's own grand ball. After the dancing had begun and the wine was flowing, and Lady Margaret stood at the glittering center of the respectable world she had built on 2 graves, that was when the servant girl would walk back into the room, 4 years the furniture, 4 years fetching and carrying and being told she was nothing, and Eleanor has arranged it so that the reckoning falls in the grandest room, on the grandest night, at the exact moment her stepmother stands crowned in the respectability she murdered for, in front of every single person whose good opinion is the only thing Margaret has ever truly loved. If you are going to stop being invisible, the servant girl has learned, you do it where absolutely everyone is looking. Lady Margaret's ball was the event of the season, and she had never in her life looked more perfectly, serenely triumphant than she did the moment the Duke of Ashford was announced, and walked in with Eleanor Hartley on his arm. The room turned, and there was the servant girl, the poor dependent, the one who had been so satisfyingly humiliated weeks before, walking into the grandest ballroom in the county in a gown of deep midnight blue, on the arm of a duke, with a small rosewood music box held in one hand and a bound folio in the other, and no fear at all in her face. "Eleanor," Margaret said, and the warmth in her voice had a blade beneath it. "How unexpected and how brave to come dressed so far above my station, yes." Eleanor's voice carried, clear and unhurried, to every silent corner of the room. "We should talk about my station, Lady Margaret, since you gave it to me." She turned, not to Margaret, but to the watching, avid faces of the whole assembled county. "Most of you know me as my stepmother's poor dependent, the girl in the corner, the one she so generously took in and so kindly reminded, at every opportunity, that she was worth nothing." A murmur ran through the room. "A few weeks ago, many of you watched her sell my dead mother's music box to put me in my place. I'd like to tell you why she truly did it, because it is a far more interesting story than the one she's told you." "This is absurd," Margaret said sharply, but her knuckles had gone white around her glass. "The girl is hysterical. My grandmother," Eleanor continued, as though her stepmother had not spoken, "left a fortune, an estate, and a title in trust, for her daughter and then for me. My mother hid the proof of it in that music box for safekeeping, because she no longer trusted the people around her. She set the box gently on the table beside Margaret's glass, and opened the false base and drew out the yellowed paper. My stepmother has known about that inheritance from the beginning. It is why she married my father, and when she could no longer bear the risk that this proof existed, she sold the box in front of all of you, not to humiliate me, but to destroy the one piece of evidence that could ruin her. She let that settle. But she failed, because a good man bought it back." The silence in the room had become the silence of 200 people, realizing they were witnessing something they would speak of for the rest of their lives. "And there is one thing more," Eleanor said, and now her voice changed, went quiet, and terrible and steady. My mother did not die of a fever. I have her letters. Letters that prove this woman knew my mother and my father and the fortune months before my mother ever fell ill. She looked at last directly at Margaret. You didn't only steal from me, Lady Margaret. You made me an orphan so that you could. It's all here. Every letter, every date, the physician's own records. Copies are already with the magistrate. It was done before I ever walked through that door tonight. A breath. I only came so that you would have to hear it. Here, in this room, in front of the only thing you have ever truly loved. Every cruelty that woman ever committed, she committed in the certainty that the servant girl didn't count, that Eleanor would never look up, that the furniture doesn't listen, and that certainty, that exact, arrogant contempt, is the thing that just destroyed her. Eleanor didn't beat her stepmother despite 4 years of being treated as nothing. She beat her with it, with every letter she was allowed to see, every word spoken carelessly in front of a girl who didn't matter, every locked case a dusting servant could reach. Margaret handed her the whole case, brick by brick, because she was so certain no one was watching. It came apart for Lady Margaret the way these things do when the proof is finally, undeniable and finally public, all at once and completely. The magistrate presented with the settlement, the letters, the correspondence, and the physician's re-examined records acted as the law acts when a respectable person is caught doing something the rest of society finds it convenient to be appalled by. The inheritance was restored in full to its rightful heir, and the graver matter, the letters, the timing, the terrible euphemisms about an obstacle removed, was opened as exactly the kind of inquiry that Margaret had spent 4 years and 2 graves making certain would never happen. She was not merely ruined, though she was that. The respectable world she had killed and stolen to enter turned its back on her as one, the way a tide goes out. And the law, at last, asked the questions about Cassandra Hartley's death that should have been asked years before. And the fortune, this was the part Eleanor had insisted upon, did not simply vanish into her own accounts. A portion of it she set aside in her mother's name, a settlement for orphaned girls left, as she had been, at the mercy of people who saw them only as something to be used. Her grandmother's money and her mother's memory would do at last what neither of the women who left it to her had been able to do in life. They would protect the ones who came after. The music box she kept. Of course she kept it. The Duke found her, the night it was finally over, sitting quietly in the library with the little rosewood box in her lap. She was not weeping. She was winding it, slowly, carefully, and letting the thin, sweet 8 notes fill the quiet room, her mother's tune, back where it belonged. It's done, Adrian said, coming to sit beside her. All of it. The inheritance is confirmed, and the inquiry into your mother's death is open at last. She can't touch you or the truth ever again. He hesitated. How does it feel? Strange, Eleanor said honestly. She wound the box again. The little tune played on. For 4 years I believed I was nothing. She told me so every day, and I very nearly believed it all the way down. She looked at the box in her hands. And the whole time, the proof that I was someone, that I was loved, that I was left something, that my mother thought of me even at the end, was right here. 8 notes and a false bottom. My mother hid the most important thing in the world inside the one thing she knew I'd never let go of. Her voice caught. She trusted me to keep it, and I did. Even when I didn't know what I was keeping, that's the part I can't stop thinking about. She trusted me to hold on, and I held on. The Duke was quiet for a moment. Then, I bought that box back, he said, because a woman's face told me it mattered. I had no idea what I was buying. I thought I was returning a keepsake to a girl who'd been wronged. He looked at her. I didn't know I was handing a lost heiress the key to her whole life, or that the girl in the corner, whom everyone in that room had decided was nothing, was the most remarkable person I would ever meet. Eleanor looked up at him, this cold, remote, difficult man who had watched a servant girl being humiliated and seen, alone in a room of 40 people, the one thing worth seeing. You noticed, she said simply, when it would have been so much easier not to. Everyone in that room looked away, Adrian, because looking away was comfortable. You looked." She reached out, and after a moment, took his hand. "I spent 4 years being invisible. I didn't need a man to rescue me. I'd already decided to rescue myself, and I'd have found a way. But I find I would very much like to spend my life beside the one person who saw me when there was nothing in it for him." She smiled and wound the box again. "So, we've a great deal still to learn about each other. Shall we begin?" The Duke of Ashford, who had turned away from the world for years, and found he could not seem to look away from her, lifted her hand to his lips. "Miss Hartley," he said, "I would be honored." And the little music box played its 8 sweet notes into the warm and quiet room, the way it had when she was a child, the way it would for the rest of her life. So, here's what I want you to carry with you tonight. For 4 years, everyone who looked at Eleanor Hartley saw a poor, plain, worthless dependent. Her stepmother made certain of it, built it, brick by brick, deliberately. Because a girl who believes she is worth nothing is so much easier to rob. That's the thing these stories keep teaching us, isn't it? Being told you're nothing is so rarely the truth. It's so often a wall someone else builds around you, on purpose, because they're standing on something of yours, and they need you never to look down and see it. And the most precious thing Eleanor owned, her whole worth, her mother's love, the proof of who she truly was, spent 4 years hidden in the one object the whole world had agreed was worthless. A cheap little music box beneath everyone's notice, which is exactly why it was safe. So, the next time the world decides someone is worthless, the servant, the dependent, the quiet one in the corner that everyone's already agreed not to see, be the one who looks twice. Ask what they might be holding that you can't see, because the people we're taught to overlook are so often the ones carrying the most precious thing in the room. And the next time someone tells you that you're nothing, hold on. Just hold on the way Eleanor held onto that music box, even when she didn't yet know what she was keeping. Because sometimes the thing they were most desperate for you to let go of is the exact thing that proves how much you were always worth. She held on, and it turned out she was worth everything all along. If Eleanor got under your skin tonight, if you believe the overlooked ones, the quiet ones, the girls the world decides are worthless deserve, in the end, to be seen, then you're my kind of person, and this is your channel. Subscribe and turn the bell on so the next story always finds you. And tell me in the comments, did you guess what was hidden in the music box before the Duke opened it? And would you have shown Margaret even a moment's mercy at the end, or let her face every bit of what was coming? I read every single one.